Hello, my name is Sean Owens, and this is the oral defense for PS 660 at Bellevue University under Dr. Matthew Croston. My paper this term was about the domestic threats to Indonesia's national security. This presentation will start with a brief overview of Indonesia, then we'll define the threats to national security. We'll look at and review the current policies Indonesia has in place to address those particular threats. We'll do a regional comparison of how those threats also affect other states and nations in that particular region of the world. We'll look at the academic prescriptions and the academic perspective related to those particular threats. And then finally, we'll sum up and review some new potential prescriptions that Indonesia may consider for addressing and mitigating the risks based on these threats. So if we start and look at Indonesia, it is the home to the world's largest Muslim population. It's spread across thousands of islands in Southeast Asia. There was a move to democracy in the late 1990s following the departure of their longtime dictator. There was an economic resurgence following the Asian financial crisis of 1997, which really put them on their current path of economic strength. During the economic crisis of the late 21st century, they outperformed their regional neighbors. And this led to Indonesia, China, and India being the only G20 members posting economic growth as of 2010. So the economy of Indonesia is strong, it's also fragile, and it's also the most important thing when we start to consider the national security of Indonesia. The national security of Indonesia is highly dependent upon a strong and growing economy. So if we look at the national security risks, there is no imminent conventional external threat. Protecting economic growth is the #1 security priority and issue. The greatest risks to that national security are internal. They come in the form of public corruption, or this is the corrupt political elites. One of the primary drivers for this corruption is the poorly defined and rarely enforced regulations, coupled with inadequate funding of the police and military. To date, Indonesia has attempted to address corruption by targeting elite government officials whose acceptance of bribes, political campaign fixing, and who are passive towards illicit trade or money laundering. Next, we look at private corruption. This includes organized crime. One of the unintended consequences of the focus on political corruption has been to allow, and in many cases foster, an environment of private sector corruption, which creates pockets of organized crime, and even potentially a climate where radicalism may flourish, as we'll discuss later in the presentation. And then finally, we'll look at the threat related to domestic terror groups. The most significant terrorist threat in Indonesia is domestic-based. It's the JI, and they're responsible for the recent attacks in Bali and Jakarta. Ineffective policies in any one of these three areas could lead to a loss of foreign investment and could then potentially damage the economy, which, as we mentioned, is the greatest threat to Indonesia's national security. So when we look at the current policies that Indonesia has in place to try and address these particular risks, each threat has been treated separately and uniquely with its own focus, its own set of resources, and its own goals. Public corruption is the primary focus, as we mentioned earlier, and the Anti-Corruption Commission, or the KPK, was formed to address this particular risk. It's been fairly popular, has had some limited successes, but because of limited resources, it's only able to address a small quantity of cases. Private sector corruption, organized crime, has been addressed through increased legislation, specialized task forces. However, inefficient resources, along with inadequate training, has led this area of Indonesia's policies to be fairly ineffective. Related to domestic terrorism, terrorism itself was not even considered to be a serious threat until 2009, until the attacks of 2009. This was addressed by forming Densus 88. This is an elite government task force aimed at stopping terrorism. They've had some successes, questionable tactics, and they're really reviewed as being reactive versus proactive. So they've garnered a very aggressive shoot first record. They've also faced a number of allegations of torture, which have drawn the ire of the Indonesian Muslim organizations and community, along with some international watchdogs. The aggressive nature of this particular counterterrorism strategy has had the unintended consequence of uniting splinter terrorist organizations and giving them a common cause, changing the face of these attacks to be more domestic targets. Particularly, the police have become a target as perhaps a retaliatory response by the terrorist groups towards Densus 88. So again, skeptics argue that while Indonesia has been successful at conducting counter-terrorist strategy, they're not necessarily successful in the area of counterterrorism. This suggests that the Indonesian police in Densus 88 are capable of arresting the perpetrators, but they continually fail to prevent terrorism and terrorists from committing their acts. So when we look at the regional comparisons that Indonesia, so these same threats that Indonesia faces, private and public sector corruption has been an issue for many Asian states. However, there's been a paradoxical effect on economic growth to date with the Asian countries versus the rest of the world. Typically, corruption prevents economic growth, but in Asia, we've seen economic growth flourish in spite of, or in some cases, there could be arguing because of this high level of corruption. The reason for this, or one of the potential reasons for this, is that political corruption in Asia, there's incentives for the politicians and for the business leaders to maximize revenue, but while they're protecting the state economies. Otherwise, they risk killing the source of their own economic gain. Regardless of the previous state, most analysts argue that this is the largest risk to the future of the regional economies. Foreign investment and global organizations will be leery about partnering with any states that are viewed as corrupt. So private and public sector corruption has become a major priority for most Asian states. Anti-terrorism, really anti-terrorism efforts are a priority for nearly all countries regardless of region. However, there is the potential for terrorism to cause more problems with the states in Asia than maybe in the West or Europe or North America, simply due to the fragile nature of the economy and the impact that acts of terror have on the national economy. We see homegrown groups like in Indonesia that are being augmented by Middle Eastern and North African groups throughout parts of Asia. And really one of the biggest risks is that there's disparate methods for investigating and prosecuting terror activities in groups across Asia. So groups are able to move from one state to another as the consequences and the actual efforts of prosecution differ from one country to another. From an academic perspective, as we look at these particular threats, political corruption, in the world of academia, we talk about the perception of corruption that must be addressed. If the public doesn't perceive that the government is addressing corruption, the actual results of the government's efforts are meaningless, as trust will be lost and the governments will continue to lose their effectiveness. One of the prescriptions that we look at from academia is that increased transparency of governmental efforts that will help win the public perception. It also puts pressure on organizations and on leaders and companies to avoid and address corruption. Regional cooperation, scholars argue that there should be norms, or there needs to be norms on addressing private sector corruption and organized crime. Otherwise, entities simply, again, like we talked about with terrorist groups, move and flow through Asia, finding places where their risk is lowered and their impacts are maximized. Academia and scholars also talk about how domestic terrorism is a greater risk during periods of political and economic transition, as we've seen much through Asia starting in the 1990s through even today. This happens when governments are perceived as being weak or weakened, or even when they're being Western or Westernized. So finally, this brings us to proposed solutions or potential prescriptions for Indonesia to consider when addressing these threats. The primary prescription that my paper argues is that they should treat these as interrelated issues, not as unique or individual phenomenon. Combining the resources and effectiveness will help build trust. So each one of these efforts faces limited resources and effectiveness. However, focusing the efforts and resources together to address could increase the ability to maximize their wins while building public trust. To do this, you can attack the linkages between political and private sector corruption first. So weak government agencies allow for private sector corruption to flourish. By strengthening those those agencies and focusing on political corruption, that should automatically shrink private corruption and organized crime, as they depend on the government to look away. Addressing the financial linkages then between political and private sector corruption and terrorism reduces corruption and limits terrorism. Increasing public support of the government reduces terrorist activities on organizations. It reduces their ability to get traction within the communities. Applying public pressure and exposure on companies and politicians that are shown or proven to be either corrupt or supporting terrorist groups will be outed and replaced through a natural cycle. So for their own survival, politicians and companies must avoid being labeled corrupt, and more importantly, they must avoid any type of association with terrorism groups or funding terrorist activities. Combining this and also focusing on the financial support of terrorist organizations, whether that's through the linkages to private sector and organized crime or to other means, but by focusing on the financial support of the terrorist organization, if you reduce their means and capabilities, they lack the ability to execute on their objectives or even to grow their populations. So this concludes the oral defense related to the domestic threats to Indonesian national security. Thank you.